Hello and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Riffe Gallery. Today we are going to have a look at the exhibition Shared State, which is curated by Jordan Buschur and Natalie Lanese. Folks, tell us a little bit about how this exhibition came to be. Tell us about why you submitted to the curatorial call and what was your idea? How did it come about?
Well, Coworker Gallery began in 2019 as a funny little idea to utilize a space in an office as a gallery space. I was working at the Arts Commission in Toledo, and I shared an office with my coworker, Crystal Phelps, and we decided to start curating exhibitions in our office. So we painted a corner of the office with black paint so that we had this rectangle to demarcate the gallery space within the office. And then we would take turns curating exhibitions, take turns leading. So for 1 month I would select a work and then Crystal would select a work in response, and then we'd trade back and forth. And it was a way that we could live with art in our office. It was a way that we could see how new connections could be made between artworks, and with those connections it sort of mirrored the ways that coworkers share space, share ideas, and can kind of help each other achieve greater understanding or spark new ideas. And so that was the origin of Coworker. This was in the fall of 2019, and then of course in the spring of 2020 everything changed with the pandemic, and we began to work remotely and no longer had access to our kind of DIY do-it-yourself gallery space. And from there Coworker sort of took some different changes, and we curated some exhibitions as pop-ups, but then there was this opportunity to submit a proposal for this gallery, and we started then thinking of this idea for Shared State. Now Crystal decided to move on into other ventures, and we invited Natalie to come in as co-curator, and that was when this exhibition really started taking off and becoming real. So it's been in the making for 4 years since we really signed the contract and made it real. Yeah. But now here we are. And so Natalie, maybe you want to talk about the show a little bit as it exists now.
Yeah, so I joined Jordan probably about 1.5 years ago, and she introduced the proposal to me, and we looked at the way that Coworker made shows previously in terms of having these 2 artwork exhibitions, and began to think about how are we going to stay true to that original ethos, but then translate it into a huge gallery space and a larger group exhibition. So what we did was decided to each curate 7 artists so that we would have a group show that includes 14 artists total, but the show is hung in such a way that each pair is hung together. So there are 7 micro exhibitions arranged throughout the Riffe Gallery, and there's 2 artists kind of in conversation with each other in each of these micro exhibitions.
So what's really kind of unique about this is that this is something that curators do all the time. They think about how works are in conversation with each other, either conceptually or materially or just visually, but you really bring it to the fore. So I'm excited for you all to talk about that with each of these pairings. You all are going to get a behind the scenes of really kind of what makes a curator think about how to place, this Tom Waits song next to this Whitney Houston song in their mixtape, So, well, let's get started. Let's talk about these artists.
Okay, great.
How about this one right here?
Sure.
So this is an artist from Cleveland. Her name is Nicole Condon-Shih. She has such an incredible process, and I should say that Jordan and I conducted all of our studio visits remotely. So last summer we had great virtual studio visits. That was the way that was most doable for us to be in touch with artists all across the state. But each of these studio visits gave us the opportunity to have a real in-depth conversation with each artist and learn so much about their process, which I think was the most fun part of it. But Nicole is working with microscopic imagery of lichens and observing their, the kind of collaborative and symbiotic nature of the organism when she translates what she observes in the microscope to wall installations, to drawings. They kind of take on this like celestial quality. It almost looks like you might be looking at something in outer space, but also seeing something under the ocean. So you really start thinking about like, how are we connected as a planet? How are we connected as a universe? And how is the key to survival happening in community and in collaboration?
And this is one of 2 site-specific pieces. And it was a joy to watch her install this work. It was very like a dance where she would place something, pull back from it, see if it was the right spot. It's really a treat to observe. Now, who did you pair with Nicole? And tell us why.
Yeah. So maybe we can move over here so that we can look at the work of Joan Clare Brown. And we paired Joan and Nicole's work together. Joan is based in Findlay, and Joan works with porcelain predominantly. This is the first time that we've seen Joan's work paired with silkscreen, so that's really exciting to see. But Joan works with porcelain and is able to really capture this tactile quality of how porcelain can hold shape and hold form. So Joan will press fabric into some areas of the porcelain so that you can start to see little bits of texture that happen, and that's from pressing the porcelain into fabric. But then there's also these details along the edges where she's almost like piping in parts of the clay to be able to give this illusion of a softness when really it's fired clay, and it is no longer soft in that way, and is in fact very fragile, but it's holding the form in this very strong way. So these pieces are referencing parts of the body, but also kind of making these cushions for parts of the body. So in here, in this piece, we have a vertebrae that is seated atop this kind of pillow form that has parts that are kind of erupting out of the side. And so it's, in some ways, it's an act of care that she is replicating part of the body in this way and then placing it in this cushion there. But she's really thinking about this interior of the body and how we can sort of think about how we care for ourselves and care for others, who has access to care, and how in community care is this commodity almost where we need to share with each other. So there's this connectedness that happens with her work that we thought was an interesting mirror or reflection with the way that Nicole was working with lichen as a form of the way that community could come together, but community of non-humans, community of like species and the earth, and those kind of larger connections of how all parts are necessary. So there was this kind of mirroring that happened between both of them, working micro, macro, but also this notion of connection and care came through. There's also just a delicacy that's in both of these pieces that we thought was really nice to see next to each other.
It's nice to see each of them have kind of these protruding aspects too. So there's an echo there. Visually they're so different, but both of them are thinking about how am I casting shadows and like presenting outside of the plane, right?
Oh yeah, that's a nice way to think about it too.
Yeah.
And you know, I will say that there are always new things that come from these placement of the work together and these conversations that we can have when we look at artists' work in relationship to each other. So even like joining in conversation with you, Kat, then it's like, oh yeah, the shadows. I didn't think about that when we were putting the work together, but there's always these kind of new levels that are revealed by being in the space, seeing the work, and being in conversation with each other around the work.
And with Nicole's piece being site-specific, we had seen iterations of this work that she had made in other spaces and other contexts. contexts. But this one is spread out more on a larger wall, and the way that she's made use of that space really brings your eye into these very intricately cut pieces. And I love the way that that speaks to these tiny kind of piped dots that that Joan's working with. So like there emerges in the gallery these connections that maybe we wouldn't have made before, especially visiting with these artists on computer screens.
Yeah.
You know, I think we had each seen their work in person at different times, but in the context of putting this show together, like we were just in for such a treat coming in the gallery today.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's move to our second pairing. So what strikes you when you see these two artists together? What struck you when you came into the gallery?
So this is the kind of the entry wall when you walk in. And here we have work by Josie Roebuck. And Josie is from Fairborn, Ohio. And Josie is working with portraiture in a really interesting way. And then it's paired with Dana Lynn Harper's work. Dana's from Columbus. And they're just both working with portraiture in this expanded sense of what a portrait might mean. But also there's some formal things that we were like delighted to find when we first saw the work in the gallery here. Just the gold of the horseshoes and the gold of the rings over there that are awaiting fresh flowers. There's all these little moments of kind of rhyming that happen between the two that even though we set up this pairing, we couldn't anticipate all of the lovely little moments of the ways that they interact with each other here.
And even similarities in materials, like the use of tassels, for instance, are functioning very differently in each artist's work, but it's nice to see that space of crossover between their practices, as well as one thing we talked about earlier was upon like very close inspection of Dana's work, she's very carefully placing rice individual pieces of rice, and from here that piece looks woven, right? Like it looks like a piece of fabric, so that the way that she's using the material mimics a stitch or something that was created on a loom. So there's kind of this tapestry kind of feeling about it, even though it's a sculptural found object and paper pulp piece. I think the other thing that struck us initially was the shape of these works as well. It was really fun to select artists who are thinking beyond certain conventions, whether that be rectangular formats or materials that might be considered fine art materials. So these are two artists who were just so inventive with what they selected to make the work with, that there's just a lot of excitement in that too.
Yes, and both of them are also working with portraiture, as I mentioned before, and the portraiture is happening in ways where it's interacting with the fabric, and some places where the fabric is kind of directing the narrative a little bit, but then it kind of comes back to the figure here. So there's almost this like push and pull between the information that's on the fabric and the information that the artist is bringing by, creating the shape of the form. And I think that Dana is playing with that too. There's veils that are over some of the figures. And so there is this kind of back and forth between concealing something or revealing something, and these layers that you can get from having this multimedia approach.
You really get a sense of both of these artists working around memory and perhaps ritual and remembrance of some kind. I think they're both looking at personal histories, but relating them to cultural histories as well.
Yeah, there's a really beautiful hand in both of these artists, like the way that the treatment is the tactility of it when you view it. It, you know, just like any kind of material-based work, we all can relate to something that has fabric, and it's similar to something that has rice or a pistachio shell. Like, we've all touched those and been part of those, and so to see them, like, it pulls you in a really lovely, soft way as well.
I like that.
Shall we round the corner?
Sure.
Let's do it. All right. Tell us about these two artists.
This is Sarah Thomas. She's an artist and photographer based in Toledo, Ohio. And behind us are the paintings of Erika B. Hess. She's based in Columbus. And Jordan and I were laughing earlier that these are, you know, we really tried as collaborators to avoid making an obvious or like the most obvious connection between our paired artists, but this was one where the visual connection was just too good to resist. So, but I think that's really what makes this pair really exciting, is Sarah's command of photography and light in how she's really creating what reads to me as a painting, and speaking very strongly using the language of abstraction. And then, you know, Erika really working in this shallow, illusory space with her painting. They're really dealing with color, you know, space, a lot of formal elements in like surprisingly similar ways that, like I said, it was too good a connection to resist.
And so formally, there's a lot of kind of rhyming that's happening between the pieces, but conceptually they're linked, but that pairing is a little bit more of a place of imagination and connection that we can kind of find for ourselves. But the way that Natalie and I were thinking about it is looking at Sarah's work. Sarah's working with found bits of plastic and detritus, and thinking about the kind of permanence of plastic on our planet, around our planet, even in our bodies with microplastics, and the ways that it has sort of these sinister implications, that it's just not going away. But she's finding a way to kind of bring us in with the beauty of color, but then kind of giving us this message of discontent a bit. And with Erika's work, there's also this idea of what impermanence might be, but it kind of plays in a different way here. So Erika has this motif of puddles and reflection within puddles. And the way that I see these figures is sort of like a way that time passes, a way that we age, a way that the earth might age too, and just kind of looking at these younger figures, older figures, phantom, ghost-like figures. There's this sense of impermanence there that I think pairs in a really interesting and poetic way with Sarah's work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I really enjoy about these being paired together too is that due to the palette of both of them, they feel joyful upon first blush. And then you peel back the layers and the anxiety comes in if you're willing to dig just a little bit deeper. And so to then have, you know, such joyful color juxtaposed with the underlying sentiments, it's just a really delightful way to kind of pull it together. And it's, I mean, you can't say no to things that pair this well. Sometimes it's just like you have to say, okay, yes, of course, they belong together, and they really do. It's such an easy pull for the viewer through the space with the vibrancy of the color and the kind of the notes that are played visually for you and pull you further into the space. And so with that, I feel like we could pull right into this corner.
Yeah.
So we have these two artists here that are both really weaving, right? Tell us how you came about pairing them together, and maybe that feels apparent, but there are other things I'd love to hear you all
Sure.
talk about.
Yeah.
Who first?
Yeah,
Go
you
for
go.
it. Get in there.
I'll go.
You go.
So the work behind us is by akeylah Wellington. She's based here in Columbus. Akeylah is using, she describes herself as a tapestry artist and is using pony beads and weaving techniques to create these tapestries that are often based on digital and pixelated imagery. So she's pulling a language from like a digital landscape into this very not only handmade and sort of ancient process, but also into like a very specific cultural material that starts to translate meaning through that material.
Mm-hmm. And we loved to think about the way that weaving and the loom is sort of this early approach to digital work, and the way that akeylah is bringing, like sort of flattening that distance between the two. And so when we were thinking about an artist to pair with akeylah's work, it just felt very nice to have another artist who was working with weaving in a non-traditional way. And that's the work of Jen P. Harris, an artist based in Cleveland area. And Jen is coming to these works from a background in painting and collage, I think was the first work that I saw by Jen. And these pieces are a body of work that began several years ago as a way to kind of get away from the idea of the blank canvas and the anxiety of the blank canvas. And so Jen found this way to bring weaving on top of the painting. So if you can see at the top, there's evidence of the structure that the weaving happens upon. So those nails at the top of the structure and the support. And so there's painting underneath and then weaving on top. And I think it's really interesting to think about the way that typically a painting is made on a woven surface, which is canvas or linen, and then that just acts as a support for the painting. But here there's this play with hierarchy, so that Jen is bringing the fabric, the threads, on top of the painting and sort of messing with that hierarchy of what gets to be seen, or what is support and what is art. And I think that that interplay becomes really interesting as a concept, but also visually, it's super interesting to walk up to the work and see how color shifts when there's a layer of thread over it that you can still see through. What's the red doing? The red is becoming purple, and that's because of the thread that is over it. So there's just this really interesting flattening of hierarchy, and then this really shallow space that exists there too.
Yeah, that obvious color mixing that isn't apparent until you realize what's happening, like the painting to that it's such a treat to have that slow look and have that revealed to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we recognized in this pairing kind of the structure of a loom and the structure of the process of weaving as a real overlap for both of these artists. So like that becoming, the process kind of driving the idea or the concept for the work. So we were really excited to see like very different ways that a simple grid is used to create image and to create an idea.
Wonderful. Let's pull you right around and talk about this pairing here. So maybe we can get in the middle of it and you can tell us about both of them. How about that?
Walk around it.
Yeah.
Okay, so this pairing is Hannah Parrett with a site-specific installation on the wall behind us. And Hannah is based in Cincinnati. And we knew Hannah's work previous to this, and the installation pieces we were really excited about. So we felt really good about inviting Hannah to make a site-specific piece here, just trusting that she would be able to make something that would be really visually exciting and Yes, she did. We were so excited to walk in and see this piece here because, you know, when it's site specific, it doesn't exist before it's in the space. So Hannah is responding to this corner of the gallery, to the ceiling, to the floor, to the baseboards, and making this work in conjunction, in relationship to this space here. So it's painted directly on the wall, but then there's elements that Hannah brought in to display on top of the painting. So there's some carved sculpture with wood, there's some found objects, and there's some pieces that were really interesting to us that are found objects made by others. So a spindle of a chair, for example, that could be made by another person or in a factory. It has this history that's embedded in the object, and also wear over time that is a participant in the making of the object and in the making then of this site-specific piece. So there's all these lovely little moments within the work that really reward closer looking. And we were thinking about how we could pair this work, thinking about time and touch, with another artist's work. So passage of time in terms of the object of the spindle or the found objects and where they originated and when. And then also this idea of touch and weathering. There's also hints at the body all throughout this piece. So even some pieces that kind of reference fingers as hooks over here, and different places where you could think about references to the body. And then it felt like a really natural pairing with this work, which I'll let you talk about, Natalie.
And this is the work of Melissa Vogley Woods, and she's based in Columbus. She uses a technique called akeylah, which is a 17th century artisanal process of layering thin layers of plaster and repeatedly sanding and polishing it to mimic the look of marble. So what Melissa has done was really perfect this process, but instead of using it to create, you know, like a door facade or something that someone might find in a home, she has applied it to creating fine art. And so in the form of both blocks that sort of function as part of the sculpture, but also a pedestal, and then these knot sculptures that sit atop them. You can see a shift in finish on these. The knots are really polished to a perfect shine. They really have that marble look, where the block pieces on the bottom have been left sort of in a slightly rawer state, and so have a bit of a different finish. Almost feel like a piece of ruin or something that may have been dug up or discovered somewhere. So when we're talking about time, again, I think with Melissa's work, you feel like you might be looking at something very old, but you're not sure. There's something impossible about these knot forms, and almost something contemporary about them too. So it kind of straddles this space between new and old. The marble finish, you know, exists somewhere between real and fake. And so there's this duality in the work that, you know, kind of keeps you guessing a little bit of what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think another really lovely thing that wasn't necessarily on purpose is the way that the color palettes complement each other.
Sure.
Like they were neither artist knew what the palette of the other artist was whatsoever. So when I saw Melissa bringing in her work and then Hannah with her sketch, I was like, oh, this is going to be exciting. But the other piece that I also visually am just like truly enamored by is the way that, yes, these are impossible knots, but also in these drawings, there's this undulating and the color changes that are selected. There's a lot of this kind of, does this visually go over or under this?
Yes.
That is very carefully planned out by the artist, which of course these are as well. So to see those kind of echoes in that conversation, such different materials, but such a lovely conversation between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So shall we take it over to these
Yeah.
large paintings
Yes.
in here so
Sounds
that it
good.
spans on either side?
Yes. So this pairing is a painting pairing. Maybe it's the only one.
It is.
It is
it
the only
is.
one. Two paintings, or two artists working with painting paired together. This is the work of Laura Truitt, and Laura is based in Yellow Springs. And we originally found Laura's work through a series, a previous series, which was drawings made from photographs that she took from her dashboard driving. And so they were these landscape images that were more about a feeling of moving through a landscape than a very specific identifiable landscape. And so we were really enamored with this feeling of moving through a landscape. And then when we saw these larger paintings, it really felt like a great way to pair in conversation with the next artist, which we'll talk about. But these are kind of moments in landscape and ideas of understanding how we might move through landscape, thinking about memory and disintegration and ways that we can identify some parts, but then our understanding might fall away in other parts. So there's plenty of moments where you can get lost in these landscapes, in the feeling of a landscape or the memory of a landscape, time of day or light or all of those different markers that kind of help us jog a memory or feel a place. So these we felt like were very evocative paintings. So the two of them here, there's the structure and then landscape and kind of disintegration between the two. And so we paired Laura's work with Dragana's work.
So these paintings are by Dragana Crnjak, who's based in Youngstown. And I liked how much Jordan talked about, the idea of moving through a landscape really inspired our selection of Laura's paintings. I think Dragana's work really talks about like a peripheral experience, or really, I think you feel like you're moving in this work. The way that Dragana drags paint across a surface, you almost feel like you might be rushing through it. And there's, these kind of strong horizontal indications to just general landscape, like a pink horizon line happening here too. So there's a connection in these artists, I think, in the way that they're capturing the feeling of being in a space, while maybe in some moments starting to depict what that space is, maybe to a point of recognition, but it's really more about remembering a specific place, being in motion, or really trying to capture like what was felt in the body and not necessarily only what you saw.
I think that's a nice way to put it. And also to think about the scale of these pieces too, if we talk about what was felt in the body, because they're larger than human scale, and so we can really be engulfed by those environments too.
Yeah, and they can hold the pairing across a gallery. That's the other thing. I know you all thought really hard about that and how you set them up within the space. And because of their size, their outsized size, they can have conversation to each other,
Yeah.
which is a treat. And there's a cute little small piece that kind of pulls you in. It still speaks to the kind of pairing that we have here. It has a little hint, a little wink, and then it brings you around the corner. It's really lovely.
We can break our own rules sometimes.
That's right. That's right. And so our last pairing, take us through it.
Sure. Do you want to start with this one?
Yeah. So the artists in our final micro exhibition on this tour are Abby Cipar. They are from Akron, Ohio, and Natalie Petrosky, who's based in Cleveland. I'll talk a little bit about Abby's work. Abby is working with textile, with sculptural material, with the idea of kind of binding forms and perhaps mutating or shifting the kind of form of the object based on gravity in the case of the suspended pieces on the wall, and on this green hook over here, or green stand, as well as kind of growing out of a space as well in this pedestal piece. The work really talks about transformation in terms of material. You know, when you look closely at these sculptures, you may have maybe an expectation of what you know, certain materials or recognizable objects might typically be a part of or what they do, but in this context, they've really been completely transformed into something different. And I think that's a lot of what Abby is interested in exploring in the sculptures.
Mm-hmm. And then to talk about Natalie Petrosky's work, there's a lot of nice relationship happening in terms of the florals that exist in both pieces.
Mm-hmm.
But both the artists, and I think the initial reason that we paired them is that they're both thinking about binding or constraints, and then how nature might burst forth and ignore those constraints. So Natalie works as a gardener, and a lot of her work is through that lens of how nature behaves and how humans try to control nature. And so fences or windows or gates are all motifs that come through in her work. And so the way that nature can kind of be contained but also move beyond those constraints was something that was really interesting to see. There's also this mirroring that happens in her pieces that's really beautiful to see, and that is because Natalie's working with found fabrics, and so there are ways to find the repeat patterns within those found fabrics that she's incorporating into the paintings. But there's also this interesting way of repetition and growth and movement, and that is coming through in these morphing objects with Abby as well, that
Mm-hmm.
just has a really interesting relationship between those two. There's an idea of collection with both of them too, the found
Mm-hmm.
fabric that Natalie's working with and the found objects that Abby is working with.
Yeah, it's a really lovely pairing, both just visually. There are so many conversations between the individual pieces, and as you said, the florals to the piecing. It's just such a little treat to come around the corner and end here, where you can just, some of these works are the hardest for me to not touch.
Yes.
You know, the little fringy bits, you're like, oh, I want to touch it so bad, but we don't do that.
They're
So-
also hung in this intimate, I think this is kind of the most intimate of the spaces that the pairs are laid out in the gallery, and that really speaks to the message of both of their work too, that like we've kind of constrained them in this little space back here, and they're like,
Thriving.
they are
Yeah.
thriving
I love that.
completely.
And it's a shared state.
That's
know?
right.
It
So,
is.
Thank you so much for joining us for this exhibition curator's tour of Shared State with Jordan Buschur and Natalie Lanese. A big thank you to the Ohio Arts Council's board, to the governor, to the legislature, and of course to you all for supporting the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and Ohio artists.